Good evening, and thank you for joining this year's Clarice Smith Distinguished Lecture Series in American Art. I'm Stephanie Stevish, the Margaret and Terry Stent Director at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Once again, this series, now in its 17th year, is generously supported by artist and SAM Commissioner Clarice Smith. Over the past 17 years, we've had an incredible lineup of speakers. And one of the remarkable things we do is we videotape all of these. So there's a great backlog, trove of these past lectures that I invite you to explore on another occasion. Also, these lectures come in threes. We each year feature a distinguished artist, a distinguished scholar, and a distinguished critic. Tonight we'll be hearing from artist Fred Wilson, and I invite you to mark your calendars for October 13th, when we'll have critic Nada Chabot, and on November 17th, we'll be featuring scholar Richard Powell. I hope you'll join us then. Tonight is my pleasure in introducing Fred Wilson, and there is much to tell you about him. He is a conceptual artist whose work investigates museological, cultural, and historical issues. These are issues often overlooked or neglected by museums and cultural institutions. He broke into the art world in 1992 with an amazing exhibition called Mining the Museum at the Maryland Historical Society. And since that time, he's been the subject of more than 40 solo exhibitions around the globe. Notably, just up the street at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, an exhibition, a retrospective exhibition, Objects and Installations, 1979 to 2000, was held by the Center for Art and Visual Culture. His work has been exhibited at museums around the country, such as the Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Allen Memorial Museum at Oberlin College, and the Cleveland Museum of Art, to name a few. Further, his work is in the permanent collections of institutions around the world, including the Long Museum in Shanghai, the Tate Modern in London, and the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne, Australia, to name just a few. Wilson also presented his exhibition Afro-Kismet in 2017 in Istanbul as part of the Istanbul Biennial, and it traveled to London, New York, and Los Angeles, if you were lucky enough to see it. Since 2008, Wilson has served on the Board of Trustees at the Whitney Museum of American Art, and he's represented the United States at the Cairo Biennale in 1992 and the Venice Biennale more recently in 2003. He has received many awards and accolades, including the prestigious MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant, the Skowhegan Medal for Sculpture, and the Ford Foundation's Art of Change Fellowship, as well as, more recently, the Brandeis University Creative Arts Award in 2019. We at SAM are proud to have in our collection a work from 2013 called I Saw Othello's Visage in My Mind. It is prominently displayed on the second floor, and I hope you'll come see it in person soon. And now I welcome Fred Wilson.
Hello. I'm going to show you a smattering of works over a long period of time, and I have so many different projects and works that this is just really just dipping your toe in. This first project this first artwork is not a recent one. It's at the Denver Art Museum. But I think I must have felt that way in college with all the tomes of the greats. And making this sculpture relieved me of, I put the burden on Atlas here rather than on me. Again, this work is called Atlas, and you have these great masters, but underfoot is a book of African art. And at the time that I did this quite a number of years ago, I was just musing on the fact of, is this the basis for, or simply just underfoot the great masters? Next slide. Next slide. My hometown, New York City, after college, I moved back to New York and I worked in various museums. I worked at the Museum of Natural History and I worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And both of them quite similar in their size and their history as far as this kind of architecture. And interestingly enough, they both have collections, sometimes very similar collections or the same kind of collections if you look at Art of the World. But how they describe them, how they talk about them is extremely different. You wouldn't even know that they were the same, made by the same people. But that is how museums are. They decide what to think about a particular work, and that's what you get to take in. So going to back and forth across the Central Park, going to each museum, really kind of refined my thinking about museums and what they were actually doing to the public, and so off I went, really thinking about museums in a very different way, a critical way. Next slide. This artwork, and this is an artwork I made years later. Another one of my experiences was in college. I was a guard at the college museum, the Neuberger, and I did it for about a year, but it really had a profound effect on me. Interestingly, when you're a guard in the uniform, you stand there, and you're become like every other artwork, except that people don't pay attention to you. You're there and doing an important job, but you're sort of invisible, and you could be any of these people could be the same person. So when I decided this was because the guards have a very important role in the museum, I decided to make a sculpture to sort of bring them to the fore. But before I showed this sculpture, I did a performance. Well, they didn't know it was going to be a performance at the Whitney Museum when they invited me to give a tour of one of their exhibitions. I had lunch with all the donors and the docents and the education staff, some of whom I had known because I'd worked in a museum and educations. And we all had lunch, and this is in the old museum uptown. And I said, okay, I'm going to change. I told them I'm going to be in a costume, and I don't know what they thought I was going to be dressed as, like a bunny or whatever, I don't know. But I said, I'm going to be in my costume, and you can meet me downstairs at my sign that says Fred Wilson Speaks at 2:00. So I left them, changed into a guard's uniform, and stood by that sign. And all the people I had just had lunch with came down and milled around in front of me, waiting for me to show up. So finally I had to say, all right, let's get this thing going. Of course, they were quite surprised and embarrassed that even the people that I knew from the education departments didn't see me standing there. But I knew this was going to happen because you put on the uniform and you disappear. And then I went around the museum talking about, in art historical terms, about problems of this particular exhibition. And the guards came off their station saying, I always want to say something about that artwork, it was an interesting project with the public sort of seeing a guard speaking in art historical terms about the exhibition. But this piece is called Guarded View. Next slide. Now, this is a museum. It is the Maryland Historical Society, as I found it when I first went there in 1990 or 91. And I walked in, I was looking at all the different museums in Baltimore to choose one to work with. And when I walked in here, I had a visceral response to the gallery, to the museum. I was uncomfortable, and I didn't really know why. I mean, I'm used to art and art of this period, and so why was I so uncomfortable in this museum? So I figured, well, if I'm that uncomfortable, this is the place I want to unpack for myself. So they gave the entire third floor to me. to do my project. Next slide. You came off the elevator or up the stairs and you saw this as the first object that you saw. This is a globe, and with the word truth emblazoned across it. And you know, to my thought, is a great way to start the exhibition. Whose truth when you're speaking about art? Whose truth in history if you're talking about history? And what is truth, in fact? This was a trophy, actually, for truth in advertising, and I don't know when they gave up the idea that there is any truth in advertising, but I wanted to have this as the first thing as you walk through. No labels or anything like that, just this, standing there looking at you. Next slide. I decided to call the exhibition, you know, the director had his own ideas about what I might want to call it. He thought maybe I would call it Museum Held Hostage. And I said, well, no, that's, you know, we'll get along quite well. You don't have to worry. He was a little nervous. Anyway, so I just basically looked at every object that they had, well, as many as I could, and put together this exhibition. And what was on view as well as what was in the basement. Of course, what's in storage tells you even more about an institution. But anyway, so here we have it. These 6 pedestals, 3 with busts. And what you have here on the right side is the far in the I'll just say the one on the far left is Henry Clay, great American. The one on the far right figure is Andrew Jackson. And in the center is Napoleon. Now, this was the Maryland Historical Society. I had no idea that Napoleon got to Maryland. And of course, he did not. But it was in the museum, so I put it there. Next slide. Ooh. So, and then there were these 3 pedestals without busts. However, I put labels on them. Harriet Tubman, Benjamin Banneker, Frederick Douglass, all 3 African Americans, all very much in the Maryland area. Nothing about them in the Maryland Historical Society. And so I just put these pedestals there. And sometimes the absences speak louder than, you know, what is actually there. Next slide. I also became very interested in the paintings that they had on the floors below. So I had them bring them up and I displayed them together, the ones that I chose. So that I don't go on and on, there was a video in this painting behind this Rip painting. I told them there was a Rip. I wanted a Rip painting. They gave me a Rip painting, and I made a video and put the face of the custodian, this African American man, behind the face of this patrician type white gentleman, and he'd look at you with one eye was the black. Back. With one eye looking at you was the eye of the painting, and the other eye was the eye of the African American man. And he would say things to you like, nobody knows I'm inside of you except mama. Anyway, I'll go on to the next slide. So each of the paintings had their own peculiarity as far as I was concerned. This painting was on the floor below, and it actually was in the picture, the first picture that you saw of the museum. And there were 7 children in the painting. Now, you see 5 there, but in fact there are 7. There's a boy sitting on the ground with his white collar on the right there, and a boy in the doorway. You see his arm. These were the label talked about the people in the 5 children in the center. but nothing was mentioned, no mention of the children in the periphery, the Black children. And so in order to really reveal them, rather than putting their names on the wall, and in fact, I found out who they were in my research, I lit them as you stepped up to the painting. Next slide. And I had groups of Black children from Baltimore. I gave them a tour of my exhibition, and I asked them what they thought these Black children were thinking or saying. And I made audio tapes of the children. And so when you stood in front of the painting, it would light up and you'd hear the voices of these children saying, as if speaking for the Black children, "Where's my mother? Who calms me when I'm afraid? Who washes my back?" Things like that. Next slide. And here's another one. This one sat by the door, the front door of the museum, and the director said to me, "You know, I never noticed that Black child there." Well, you know, that's a stretch. I mean, he must have been there, a long time to sort of not notice. But at any rate, the voice from the painting said, "Am I your friend?" Of course, it was children whose voices were coming out of the painting. "Am I your friend? Am I your brother? Am I your pet?" And clearly, he could have been all three. You see, the white child has the bow and arrow, and the Black child has the bird, and he was like the golden retriever in this image. And after we took the painting down, we realized that the Black child had a metal collar around his neck, which, you know, how it sat there for as long as this museum was open, and nobody noticed that. Anyway, next slide. This little painting I thought was sweet. It was called Country Life. It's painted by Ernest Fisher in, I think it was 1850 or 18, something like that. And you know, Country Life, the title was not, you know, people were not naming their paintings. The artists, I should say, were not naming their paintings at that time. So somebody else in later years named it Country Life. It could have been the curator, it could have been the registrar, it could have been the collector or the dealer who sold the painting. But anyway, it wasn't the artist. So I figured, well, if it wasn't the artist, then I could name it too. And on the other side of the painting, I put a label and I called it, next slide, Frederick Serving Fruit. Could have been Frederick Douglass, and by accident, my name is also Frederick. But it's amazing what a label can do to your perception of an artwork. Next slide. And here I found this incredibly beautiful repoussé silver, and everything was organized largely by the material, you know, what they were made of, and in connoisseurship fashion. And so I decided to put them out there, and also in connoisseurship fashion. But I also, I'm calling it metalwork. However, I looked in their ledger books and found something else made of metal around the same time. Of course, that is slave shackles. And but you know, and of course, you would never, you know, have them in a. I say you would never. I'm speaking about a museum at that time. Certainly would never have them, you know, in the same case. They wouldn't have them in the same room, let alone in the same case. But you know, they speak to each other in very profound ways. I mean, who could have, who had to serve the silver? Who could have made those objects in apprenticeship situations, which happened at the end of slavery? And of course, whose labor produced the wealth that could actually produce the silver? Next image. Oh, and there we go. If you need to get up close and personal with it. Next slide. I did many other things in that installation. It was a very big show, and it changed my career. But here, for the better. Here, I started being invited by all sorts of museums around the country, and did many in contemporary museums, and also museums with varieties of collections. But I'm showing you just a few the highlights of particular ones. This one was, I was invited by a contemporary museum to do a project anywhere I wanted. And I went to, this is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which actually part of my family is from, which I'd never been to North Carolina, so, or to Winston. So I said, well, yes, let me see, let me sort of double duty, see family and see this area. I came across Old Salem, which is what this is called. It's kind of a historic village, much like Colonial Williamsburg, only on a smaller and more simpler scale. And that in the center is the home Moravian church, where the Moravians who came to the United States in the 1600s for religious freedom and settled in North Carolina, one of the places they settled. And yes, George Washington did sleep there, at least one night, as far as I know. Anyway, they worshiped, they had a very special credo, a special religion. Everybody worked for God. The spouses were chosen by lot. And they separated themselves from the rest of the Southerners to sort of keep this environment the way they wanted to keep it. That's the home Moravian church, and in front of it they have these really beautiful white stones for the buried Moravians. Next image. So I was to do a project there, and I didn't know what I was going to do. But I did find some objects in different buildings, and I just pulled them together. And I read, I asked, were there African Americans? How did it go? I don't want to forget it. They said, as soon as I walked in, they said, "Oh, there were Black people here." And I said, "Oh, really?" I hadn't asked, but I said, "Really?" So it started on my trek to sort of find them, and of course there was no remnants of anything about them, except the memorials when they died. And so I fashioned the project from looking at the memorials, essentially. This was a tableau of R.H., I don't even know what her name was, who died in childbirth. Next. This is Rose, represents Rose, who worked in a still. Next. And this is a leather-bound Bible and a slave whip. They told me that they were nice to the slave, but they were still slaves. And so, and the label, as you can see, says leather bound. Next image. I was looking around for a building or all the structures that were there, and this one was the only one that was not really well, maintained. The grounds were, as you can see, and the building itself was, obviously not on the tour path. So I said, "Well, what is this building?" And they said to me, "Oh, well, that was the Black church. We use it for storage." And I was like, "Oh, really? Well, can I use this building?" They said, "Sure." So they did clear it out and allowed me to install a project in the space. And I'm only going to show you a couple of pictures, but it was, you could hear the sound of a pews rustling and singing as you walked up to it. And when you got inside, there was no one there. And one other thing occurred that was quite fascinating. As you see, it was a church, and in front of the church, unlike the home Moravian church, there were no stones. And apparently there were stones, big white stones, for each of the deceased who was in the ground. And so I asked, "Well, all right, where are the stones?" And people said, "Well, we don't know." So I thought, well, I'll just look around and see if I find them. I looked under the church, I looked behind the church, I looked, in the upper level of the church, and I looked in other buildings, and I could not find the stones. So I just continued on my way and decided to, well, I decided, well, maybe I should just lift the floorboards of the church. Next slide. Oh, before I even did that, I decided to, because I hadn't found the stones, I decided to make silhouettes of individuals from the neighboring Black church, which is set apart by a stream and woods. And so I put these as stand-ins for these stones. But a little frustrated and tired, I said, well, why don't we just look? This is a historic building, but can we at least open up, look in the walls and lift up the floorboards of the church? And so they did that. Next slide. And there they were. Hadn't been seen. Nobody remembered this. Nobody knew. Timothy, a native of Africa. Rose, R.H. The stones were thrown under the church or stacked, holding up the joists of the church. This part of the church was a slightly newer extension on the old church, and maybe it was not as stable, and so they put them under there. No one in the historic village knew anything about this, and they obviously hadn't done much looking. So before, of course they got excited, but to find this, embarrassed and excited. But there was a Leland Ferguson, who was an archaeologist, was working there and asked me if we could just not move them until he got to study them, and which was great. And so I just lit them and put a plexi floor so you could walk into the church and see the stones, but also walk into the church. And there was more to see, but this was the most amazing find probably of any of my projects. Next slide. Now, this is totally different. I have two practices. One is making things, and the other is doing these projects with institutions and their collections. I was invited by a glass, not a museum, but a glass school in Seattle, and I decided, well, I could work with any material. I'm a conceptual artist, so let me just work with glass. And so I went out there and see what I can do. I didn't know, and so I decided to limit it to black glass, because glass is so amazingly beautiful. Anything you do looks like something beautiful, but I want to limit it so that perhaps what I do can have meaning, which is really important to me. So I used black, and these forms came out of just working with the glass blowers, and I kind of liked this drip form a lot. It looked like tar, it looked like oil, it looked like ink. And for some reason, I decided to put eyes on a couple of them. This piece is called Drip, Drop, Plop. And I realized after a while that these eyes hark back to my childhood, seeing those 1930s cartoons recycled in the 50s and 60s, where a black person either becomes or comes out of ink or comes out of oil or tar. And that really shocked me that was still deeply lodged in my brain for it to come out in this project. So I worked with this glass in this way for a while, and then eventually I jettisoned the eyes, because I was more interested in other relationships with, well, you'll see. Next slide. Well, you'll see later. This is Venice, the Venice Biennale that I was representing the United States in. And, this building, people told me, look, fairly Jeffersonian. This is what I did to it too. I don't know if you can see it. Jeffersonian, But I was more interested in Venice. I mean, here I was in Venice. You turn around and there's all of Venice. And so why would I worry about, people thought I might do something about American slavery in Venice, but I'm saying, this is Venice. I'm going to really, get into Venice. And actually, I began looking at lots of paintings in the Academia and other museums. And because this is where my brain goes, I noticed all the African people in many of the 15th century paintings and 16th century paintings and paintings by Tiepolo and Carpaccio and Mantegna and Veronese, many, many Africans in Venice over the centuries, especially the early centuries. So this was very exciting and surprising. And although I was aware of one or two paintings, the treasure trove of Venice, because Venice was where everyone went through, was amazing to see Black Anglieri and just all the different people living and working in Venice, a place where everybody from around the world could come and have a role. What you see here in the center, you probably can see that there are these two huge figures holding up the Capitol. And when you get up close, you'll see that they are just scrims. And there are scrims all over Italy, all over Venice, where they're working on buildings. But these scrims are of these huge sculptures that are in the Frari Church. Somebody said, well, you are doing something about African-American slavery. And I said, no, these are huge Africans who were, contraband from the Turks after the wars between the Venetians and the Turks. And there are these huge sculptures in the Frari Church holding up the tomb of a doge at the head of the country. And I just had to use them in some way. Here we have the great empire of the United States and the great empire of Venice, and it's the connection, perhaps, are enslaved people. Next. As you walked in, I painted the interior, the colors of Venice, Venice interiors, not the white, clean white box that one would expect for an exhibition. At any rate, in front of many of the hotels, and I don't know if they still do it, because after I had this piece and other pieces, some of the Venetian folks got a little embarrassed and took them away. But anyway, there are these boys made of polychrome wood holding a pillow, and what that's about, I don't know. And I basically took the head off and put this globe, and it's called the Wanderer. Next slide. Also above your head there, as I'm just having glass in my head, as I like to say, I was thinking about glass. And of course, Venice has incredible, Rosanico style, 18th century style glass. And on Murano, I was thrilled to find a glass master who would make this. I asked for a really huge chandelier, huge. He said, I can make anything. What do you want? I can do it. I said, I want to make it, I want to make it black. And he says, black? Artists. He says, I can do anything. I work with Yoko Ono. I work with anyway. So anyway, he made me this huge chandelier, very traditional chandelier in black glass, the first black glass chandelier in the world. But to me, it took on a whole other life in black, because they use pastel colors generally to sort of reflect light, to make the room lighter. And here you're stuck with the spindly, skeletal, but still beautiful image of the glass. I called it, and I called the exhibition, Speak of Me as I Am, which is a line from Othello. And of course, Othello is the most famous African in Venice that never lived. And I can always come back to the lines of Othello, because it's such an amazing Shakespeare, just caught something. His language is just so rich that I use a lot of his lines when I'm working on these chandeliers. And so this was called Speak of Me as I Am, because I feel like this was the epitome of Othello. He was magnificent, he was mournful, and he was monstrous all at once. Next slide. Here's a couple of pictures of the close-ups next when I came to the States. Next slide. Next. So I really was very invested. I still am. I have a Venetian person a Venetian glass master who I make works with when I go to Venice. I'm going there in, around Christmas this year. Excited. But this work is called "To Die Upon a Kiss," another line from Othello. And what it is clear glass shifting to a grayish glass down to black glass. And to me, it's like a body that is, losing its life, and which was sort of what was happening in the Othello play. For me, it's a very special one. Obviously, it's the Venetians always love when I come because I do things that they never would think of with their own forms, and they know how to make them. It's just a really great experience working with them. I was going to say something else about this, but oh, yeah. Well, when I made this, my father was really ill. And I really think, this is that moment of him, his passing, losing his chi, his blackness, his power, with his soul perhaps going up, as somebody else has said to me. Anyway, To Die Upon a Kiss. Next slide. Close-ups. Next. Next. I also was very interested in their mirrors. So I decided to stack them, but of course make them black mirrors. And I love going to Venice, going to Murano, because they scratch their heads about these things, crazy things I come up with, but they know how to make them so it gets them excited, and they really enjoy doing it because it's something new, but it's what they know. And this piece is called Iago's Mirror, because I really thought that, if Iago was looking at Othello with all this rage and all this jealousy and anger, that it sort of becomes huge in his mind, just takes over his brain, and he hatches this horrific scheme. Iago's Mirror. Next slide. Here's a close-up of various layers of mirrors that they create. They're actually real full-on mirrors just piled on each other. And it's a very big work. Next slide. This one is called I Saw Othello's Visage in His Mind. And this is a line from Othello spoken by Desdemona, because she was trying to convince Othello that she should go with him to Cyprus, because she just loved him so much. And Othello said, "Are you crazy? You'll get killed over there." Basically, I'm sort of paraphrasing, but and so I just saw this round mirror as something of her kind of reflection on Othello, her seeing Othello, and how she saw him. Next slide. Here's more of the drips, and an early one as well, because you see eyes on there. This is called Dark Dawn. Next image. This is called The Ominous Glut. Again, without there are eyes there too, but I am thinking about oil and such. Next slide. I've been making works for quite a while when this Biennale was dropped in my lap for the Istanbul, and I thought I couldn't have been more a perfect moment to go, because I was very well versed in the history of Venice and knew some about the history of the Ottomans and Venice, and because in the paintings they're all there. Either they're battling or they're they're merchants and bartering and sharing and selling. It's all in the paintings. And so to come to Istanbul, which is an incredible city, just incredible like Venice, was just a dream. So what was the first thing I was going to do? Was make a chandelier, because it's a combination of the Rosanico style Venetian chandelier and the Ottoman sort of canister chandeliers. And they are together in one way or another. This is called, I have to remind myself what some of these are called. The Way the Moon's in Love with the Dark. That's a line from Pushkin, one of his poems, the Egyptian series. And it just seemed to really, it was just perfect. And the other two folks that I really love besides Shakespeare is Pushkin and Baldwin, James Baldwin. All of them sort of kind of get rolled together in this exhibition, which unfortunately I want to show you just a little bit of because I don't have that much time. Next. Here's a close-up of the sort of the Ottoman canisters within the Venetian glass. Next. And obviously I did many things. This was an Orientalist museum in Istanbul, so there were many paintings from that period, and many of them, or actually all the ones I chose, had a Black person in them. And in fact, I went with the collection manager and I said, "Dude, can I have some images of that have a Black person in it?" And he said, "No, we don't really have many of them, maybe one or two." And of course, when I'm there, I find them all. And this happened at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as well, so it's not just the curators in Istanbul. At any rate, I did the traditional tile work as well. Next image. This is using a tile wall, two tile walls, using traditional colors and traditional way of installing this. And when I told them the colors that I want to use, they said, "That's fine, that's traditional." But I told them I wanted to do the black background instead of the black being on the foreground and the blue being in the background, and mixing the colors in different ways, the traditional colors. They said, "You can't do that." I'm like, "What do you mean I can't do it? I'm doing it." They said, "You won't see anything." And of course, I sort of, knew that this was a really big leap for these tile makers, because they used to doing things in a particular way. Of course, when they saw it, they were very thrilled. Now, this Arabic, Turks don't speak or read Arabic, and they have a history. But I used Arabic because that's what you see in the mosques. And so this is about a memory, not necessarily being able to read exactly what it says, but it's about this memory from another time that's actually in their midst. It actually says, "Black is beautiful" in Arabic. Next slide. And this last image from this exhibition I'm going to show you is one of these Orientalist paintings. There are many Blacks during the Sultan's era. All of them eunuchs, or the great majority of them eunuchs. And of course, there are many white eunuchs as well, because the Turks, the Ottomans were taking people before they got to the Africans from Europe. When the Europeans ran dry, they started pulling them from Africa. And the label, what I have above it is a line from a book by, well, another country, the book of James Baldwin, because what's so fascinating to me is such an incredible writer, and the people kind of, you can sort of know them because he imbues such humanity into his characters in his books. At any rate, so I used a line for this, and the line is, next slide, Love is a country he knew nothing about. Love is a country he knew nothing about. Next, and this is the last sculpture I'm going to show you. It's chandelier parts and beads, and it's a mapping of the Atlantic slave trade, the Indian Ocean slave trade, and the Pacific slave trade, and the consumers and producers of oil. The artwork is called The Unnatural Movement of Blackness. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. That was amazing. I feel like I need a few minutes to think about this, but we're actually going to jump right in to Q&A. For our audience, thank you all for submitting questions early. And if you still have some other questions, we have about 15 minutes. So Fred, I will share with you some thoughts and questions from our audience.
Okay.
So I will start with this one. We would love to hear more about your observation that what's in storage says even more than what's on view in a museum. Do you use storage to return the repressed?
I wish I could hear more of what that question really means, but I'm a guest in the museum. I know that I will find things, and they know I will find things that they're not even thinking about. What I do is try to reveal these hidden truths that, these collections were created not by the curators who I work with, generally speaking. The things are there. And so I try to bring out the issues that I see as prevalent and important. So for the world to see. And obviously, when I'm doing my work, there are things I don't use that are also very, can be really problematic. And so these are kind of conversations I have with the staff once they're kind of comfortable with me being this person from the outside coming into this museum space. And it is my great hope that they take the challenge and deal with some of these issues that are embedded in the museum. The museum is church, but also not sort of. It is not. They should not take on the museum as what happens in a museum often. Take on as you are the museum, and so you were not there when this thing came into the collection, but you are the steward, and you need, now that I've sort of revealed this, or it's now become a conversation, you need to take it further and deal with the issues surrounding it. So we have great relationships. They're nervous when I get there, but they realize I work with museums and I understand them, and I push them as far as I can as an individual. I'm not there to embarrass. I'm not there to shame. As I said, these collections were created long ago, but with the stuff revealed, they need to, beseech them to deal with it.
Great, thank you. Somewhat related to what you find in museum storage collections, what are your thoughts about the movement to repatriate tribal and indigenous objects to the original creators and owner? And do you think that move is going to change how museums continue to go forward in their collecting practices?
It's the museums that I have worked with have been very proactive with this process, at least while I'm there. And some institutions, when I first started going to these museums, they were scratching their heads. But now individuals, it's not always the whole museum. It's a museum is full of different people. There are individuals who take on the mantle to try to deal with, move the museum forward on these issues. I don't stay long enough to sort of follow up on how they've done. I just sort of am there as a catalyst to that it's been revealed to an outsider if they knew about the stuff, or show things that they have not considered. But I think it's now it's been a while since I've worked with a museum, with an institution that has these kind of objects and such. I'm a thoroughly press them on at least my opinion about them having these things in their halls, and and also beseech them to not be afraid and bring people in and to have these discussions and show them. I mean, a friend of mine, it was in New Zealand, and a Maori friend of mine came to a museum in the States, and actually his grandmother came and saw something that was her father's or her mother's object, and she cried. And the museum said, "Here, take it." The museum registrar was so taken by the situation. So they have to not be afraid, and they have to deal with that everybody wants the best for the object and the people, and you just have to figure out how you can do this and make it happen. And there are many museums that are, and so it's not like they have to make up a new, make it up all new. There are places, Denver Art Museum being one of them. I was not there very long, there not too long ago, that are really, they've got the right community to come and professionals who come and make this a museum for all, and take the issues that are holding back the museum and do the right thing.
Thank you. We do have a lot of folks who are very interested in your thoughts on collections policies. We'll get to some of those in a moment. But another thing folks are really interested in are the gravestones from the Black church in Winston-Salem. And I will also say, I went to undergraduate at that college and interned in Old Salem as an undergraduate.
What?
So
how crazy.
I'm very familiar with these white headstones that you talked about. God's Acre is where the folks are buried.
Yes.
And
but were you familiar with the Black church?
So we're just gonna have a conversation now, you and me, for everyone here. Was that St. Philip's, or was it a different church? Because when I was there, St. Philip's was a Black church. It looked very similar, but it was in like the middle of.
Was it on the grounds?
Mm-hmm. It's like the very far end. Yeah. So now it's restored, but I'm also trying to remember there was like a cutout in the floor, and now I'm like, am I misremembering? Did I see your work?
Wow.
So, but folks are really curious what happened to those stones, and what did the organization do? And I've just revealed, like, that's the church was restored and now is actually part of the interpretive plan of the organization.
Oh, well, I'm really glad to hear it, because I went down, I was just happened to be in the area, and nothing was happening. And there was the people who I worked with were no longer there. There's one couple who were carrying the torch, but they didn't have, the museum was not necessarily, this was not their main. I sort of brought something up that was, like, oh Lord, now we got to deal. They didn't, I never heard anything like that, but it was just like, they didn't, this was not what some of those people came to Old Salem to do, and it's not in their wheelhouse, they would not. So, and so when I was there, when I came back, they were concerned that if they, retired, or if they left, or if they passed away, what would happen? And so I mean, if you're saying that they have taken this seriously and restored the church and keeping keeping these stones and the history and doing more research, then that's fantastic. Glad to hear it. They never mentioned me, by the way. They all, of course, they figured this out themselves.
I can write to a few folks.
Well, I don't want any things. Check in on some things. Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, that's folks are really interested to hear. And Old Salem is the organization if folks are interested in looking that up and learning more. And St. Philip's is the church that's there. So yeah, so for personally, that was really exciting for me to hear. So a lot of folks are really curious about how your work and unveiling these issues and the objects through these different collections, has it changed collections policies and interpretive strategies for organizations, or do you, as you just said, you didn't know about Old Salem?
No, and I don't really, because I move on. I'm sort of like, the Lone Ranger, going off in this, I don't, so I don't know. Sometimes I go to a museum just going and realize someone knew something about what I was doing because of how they speak about it or how they display things. But I really don't know, I just don't look back. But it is really something worth doing to see what has changed since the institutions that I did something with and that made an impression on them and the public, what they're doing to keep in their way to keep these ideas fresh and new and forward thinking.
Thank you. We have time for about 2 more questions. Thank you all. There's so many questions and I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. This was a fantastic presentation, so we'll just have 2 more and then we'll wrap up for the evening. This one's a little bit long, but I think it reflects what a lot of folks have asked. I was lucky enough to see Mining the Museum when I was an undergraduate in the early 90s. It's striking to revisit now, especially in light of the widespread Black Lives Matter protest last year, in which many cases involved, of course, the removal of statues, production of empty pedestals, somewhat in reverse of yours in your show. Curious to hear your thoughts looking back at that work in 2021, and secondly, whether others have been reaching out to you about its resonances with all of the monument activism of late.
I just think it's terrific that even if a museum is not picking up the mantle, there are people who are and a new folks in the field, sort of bringing a new way of thinking to the institutions. There's a book there about what happens since Mining the Museum, and also what happens since all these projects I did in different museums. What happens with largely is that a lot of the people that I worked with, museum people, they move around, they go to different institutions. And sometimes I see something that seemed like what that they must have been involved with me in a way. It's because they moved to another museum and putting this into practice in another institution. I don't know any specific things about sort of trailing out of my thought pattern about what you said. What was that question? Part of that question again?
The resonances of your work and the social movements today, which I think can kind of lead us into another question. What are the contemporary social issues, if any, that are currently impacting how you think and create your art?
I'm on my own path, and so I don't really, and I don't, I get influenced like everyone does about what is going on and the new issues that are happening. And I haven't, since Istanbul, which is 2017, I haven't done another museum project. And so I'm sort of due for one or two. But so basically I'm a sponge. I'm a sponge in a museum, and I'm a sponge in general, just absorbing contemporary culture, issues, and when institutions, the institution itself, and then it goes through my system, comes out. So I don't, it's a very natural process, and not something that I, have a thesis for. However, and certainly if I'm in a situation where a particular subject seems to be germane, that's where I go. But it's been quite a while since I've done anything, and certainly haven't done anything since Istanbul, so that really would reflect these times. I'm just thrilled that the conversation is going where it's going, and that actually there's action involved with monuments and such. I'm thrilled, even if nobody's calling me, thrilled to have been a part of it.
Well, fantastic. You all have so many wonderful questions, and I'm so sorry we can't get to all of them. Fred, thank you so much for your time this evening. Thank you for sharing your work and your wisdom with us. It has been an absolute pleasure to listen to you and learn from you. I feel like I have a reading list that's incredibly long now. I've got to revisit my Shakespeare. It's just been absolutely wonderful. For folks who want to revisit this was recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. We also ask that you not close out your Zoom browser quite yet. When we sign off this program in just a moment, please answer a few questions for us, help us learn a little bit more about you so we can bring you even more fantastic programs. Thank you again, Fred, for
Can I say
kicking off.
one thing?
Yes, please.
I want to give a shout out to the Dixons. I know you're out there, so hopefully we meet and get together sometime, soon after this pandemic craziness. My Dixon family.
There we go. Dixons, get in touch with Fred. Well, thank you all so much. This has been a pleasure. Thank you, Fred, for kicking off the Clarice Smith Distinguished Lecture Series. We hope all of you will sign up for the remaining two in October and November. I'm Gloria Kenyon, Acting Head of Public Programs at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and we are delighted you've joined us this evening. Have a great night and take care, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.